Hi, I'm Jules and I'm a senior at the University of Washington studying community, environment, and planning with minors in landscape architecture and comparative history. For my capstone, I've spent the year researching Indigenous land stewardship values, techniques, and practices in Western Washington and considering how we can best integrate those values into contemporary landscape architecture and environmental planning for climate disaster-related mitigation. I'm looking specifically at shoreline and marine communities because those environments are projected to be most immediately impacted by the climate crisis. Indigenous land stewardship practices as we know them today date back as far as people have settled on the North American continent. Native peoples have known how to listen to the land and how to offer care and protection in return for all that it gives us to sustain life, community, and society. The crisis of the changing climate can't be pinned directly on one point in history where everything went wrong, maybe sometime around the Industrial Revolution, but one could argue it happened earlier than that, somewhere along the way to encourage that kind of extreme growth in population and technology. When considering facets of the climate crisis, one of the many issues that doesn't receive proper widespread recognition is the issue of land use and resource management. Resource depletion and scarcity is the result of poor land stewardship. Natural disasters are often, too, the result of abusing the land. Land is abused when those maintaining it deplete it of its wealth of natural resources without sustaining the land's needs. One of the roots to this resource depletion is applying improper landscape governance techniques. When Europeans colonized North America, they didn't only brutalize its native people and settle on ancestral native lands, they altered its natural features and functions to fit their notions of beauty and landscape design. Some examples of these inappropriate uses include traditional lawns, golf courses, and savanna-like landscape architecture, which typically looks like fields of green with random sprays of deciduous woodland trees, which are pretty similar in appearance to England and the UK. Beyond aesthetic and design-oriented land use, land and soils have been abused through agriculture, especially monoculture systems, overdevelopment or ecologically hazardous development in residential and commercial real estate, restricting natural sediment flow through damming, and other forced landscape stability strategies. Many effects of climate change are already in motion and cannot be stopped, but their impacts on human settlements, natural landscape integrity, and coastal communities specifically can be mitigated through a paradigm shift in landscape architectural practice towards a respect, appreciation, and integration of Indigenous land stewardship values. These changes must come most directly from within the field of built environments, but also from collective awareness and action. This collective action can influence individuals to reach their potential in sustainable practices and push for change on a systemic level in both land use and in environmental equity for Indigenous and other marginalized communities. For my methods, I conducted an extensive literature review and interviews with planners, leaders in the Quinault and Makah tribes, UW educators in landscape architecture and urban planning, and professionals in fields of land use and management to learn about different perspectives on decolonizing land use on our coasts. I was most interested in how Western perceptions of Indigenous scientific knowledge are impacted by how that knowledge is archived through the arts, and then how that affects how we approach land use in colonial society. According to research by Lipovsky and Caldwell in Indigenous Marine Resource Management on the northwest coast of North America, the ethnographic and archaeological records demonstrate that Northwest Coast marine management was enacted on different spatial and temporal, social, and ecological scales. Ecologically, resources were managed at the species level, like seabird egg harvest, egg transplants, and clam size and age restrictions, at the level of community, like fish net sizes, and at the level of ecosystems, like cleared beaches and removal of beaver dams. Ecosystem-level management resulted in anthropogenic landscapes which attracted resources, increased and diversified habitats, and increased productivity. This research is one of the many beginning to acknowledge the complexities of native sciences and systems in this place. One challenge, however, is the misconception that these peoples had a low level of foresight to the environment and only performed small-scale alterations and adaptations to the land. Ethnographic data will always tend to highlight the more subtle, daily, and often local actions involved in management and traditional ecological knowledge, whereas the archaeological record will tell the story of more dramatic landscape modifications and the cumulative action of many events. Pre-colonial Indigenous land stewardship was not limited to surviving off the land as is most often depicted in Western media. Instead, Native people exemplified complex systems of control over their environment, even and especially in challenging marine ecosystems in Western Washington. Widening our understanding of these practices gives more appropriate credit to the strategies and the peoples inventing them, making them more competitive against contemporary marine infrastructure techniques that can either fail or further exploit the land or coastal communities. The best way to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into planning is by creating space for Indigenous people to make change in our communities and regain power and sovereignty over the land. In the words of the American Society of Landscape Architects, integration of members of Indigenous communities in design, planning, and management for cultural landscapes can improve the sustainability, authenticity, and meaning of these significant places. Interactions between Indigenous community members, designers, other stakeholders, and site managers lead to greater insights and improved preservation of culturally defined aspects of significance. Through my literature review, my conversations, and through putting forth a greater effort to connect with the land on a deeper personal level, I've developed conclusions that move me away from exploring direct planting design techniques for disaster mitigation and instead towards solutions that are more oriented around confronting the lasting effects of oppression of Indigenous peoples, the perpetuation of colonialism through the globalized economy, and our harsh expectations for how land should act over time. I went on a site visit to the Olympic Peninsula coast to learn more about the land itself and the Makah, Quileute, and Quinault tribes that steward it. In distancing myself from the city, I was able to think more clearly about the connotations of the disaster management strategies I've been researching. I noticed that preventing landslides, for example, is done in a similar way between Indigenous and contemporary Western practices. Most often, some kind of grass or greenery is planted alongside unstable cliffs to develop sturdy root systems to uphold the sediment. Why did I think those solutions would be so different? I confronted in myself that I perceive them to be different because Indigenous practices are so culturally othered that they can be seen as almost low-tech solutions contrasted by modern American sciences. The differences between the development of solutions is the scope of the methods, the way we record and archive data, and the globalized nature of scientific research and solution. This can lead to incredible collaboration and innovation, but what are some of the challenges that come with it? How are they holding us back from embracing non-mainstream sciences? According to a study by Athaide and Simone focused on reconnecting art and science for sustainability, there is widespread recognition that the Indigenous knowledge systems are vital components of environmental management, biodiversity conservation, and sustainability. What science designates as Indigenous knowledge is rooted in a different worldview than Western science and, as such, works under different starting points, assumptions, and rules. I began to see a pattern in disaster mitigation handbooks. If a stream channel begins to change, we direct it back to where we think it should be. When precipitation causes a flood, we ship in sandbags, and when the sand is gone from the beaches in the winter, we import sand to restore the coast to what we think it should look like. When does the land catch a break? Why do our preferences for the natural environment trump its inherent ever-changing nature? And most importantly, which land are we prioritizing? When we import what we perceive to be natural solutions to climate change-related events and problems, we most often bring those resources in from more vulnerable areas, negatively impacting those who live there, and in doing so, perpetuating colonialism in the built and natural environments through material transport and inequitable labor. Through moving away from centering on climate mitigation strategies and towards a greater emphasis on climate resilience and adaptation in coastal and marine communities, we might be able to address the discrepancies between how the land provides for us and how we treat the land in reciprocity, and in doing so, return to the initial research question. How can we integrate these two systems of knowledge with a deeper sense of respect and equity for traditional ecological knowledge? The question returns us to the previously mentioned confrontation of the tension in Western colonial society between arts and sciences. I was interested in conveying my research, which I understand to be a relatively niche dive into the already small field of landscape architecture, in a way that is accessible to those outside of built environment fields. I wanted to avoid dropping my findings into the echo chamber of academia and excluding those whose access to it has been limited, perpetuating inequity in access to ecological knowledge and ideas, which I believe to be one of the reasons we're this deep in the pit of the climate crisis to begin with. I grew a new appreciation for art as a system of ecological knowledge sharing, and through the lens of Indigenous culture, recognized it to a greater extent as an incredibly powerful archival tool for ideas in science and technology. With that in mind, I've developed a set of 5 prints, each correlating to a climate change-related issue and an approach to adaptation with an emphasis on Indigenous land stewardship values and techniques. These prints have been compiled into a zine that I'll be distributing for free to my community, and prints themselves will be available for purchase on my website with sliding scale pricing. All proceeds will be returned to the Indigenous communities of the Olympic Peninsula in return for the use of their ancestral ecological knowledge and to help encourage economic equity and resilience in the face of the climate crisis on Washington coastlines. This project has helped me set very high standards for myself to work with and for Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities to develop equitable climate solutions. My research has helped me develop context for a deeper respect and love for the land and all it gives us, to work with it in reciprocity and utilize its abundance while rejecting colonialism in the built and natural environment.